I'm just expressing that when we moved away from a duty-based society for women, I can't think of any actual obligations that women have as far as duties to society, but I can think of actual obligations that men do have still as a duty to society. And so it seems that women themselves actually have more rights in modern society than men do. And also, right, that a lot of this movement towards the idea of more additional rights comes from materialism itself. Everything seems to staunchly revolve around I want, me, I want, because it feels good.
Okay. Sure. I'm not sure. Maybe we could get more clear on materialism there. I'm not for the draft. I am for people voting. I think people should vote. So if you're making descriptive claims about like, okay, well, you think that this moved towards materialism, and I'm thinking maybe you're talking about like Marxist materialism, or do you mean something totally, do you mean materialism in a totally different field? Yeah,
in this case, very simple, right? I'm just using materialism in the sense of stuff in the replacement for something that is not stuff. Like, for instance, if we're talking about concepts of God, of country, of nation, of state, things like that, which could be fulfilling, and materialism would be the idea that like stuff can be fulfilling, like actual material goods, things like this can be a form of fulfillment.
Okay, so materialism, from what you're defining, is that material goods can be fulfilling.
Yeah.
Okay, this has to do what with feminism?
That what feminism has done is move women more towards materialism than duties. Duties would be this idea of the conceptualization of I ought to do things outside of because it feels good. Whereas materialism is, I'm going to get this stuff because it feels good.
Right. I mean, I can think that people should do things because I think it would have good outcomes for them. Like, I think that people should vote because I think that that helps them pursue their political goals more. And I think that people enjoy freedom. I think that's good for people's well-being, is to have personal freedoms.
Doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that limiting people's personal freedoms is pretty good for their well-being.
Well, it seems, okay, well, in some senses you would agree with that. In some senses you wouldn't, I assume.
Yeah, in some. You can make delineation thresholds, but everybody voting has been a disaster. It's been terrible.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that by everybody being able to collectively vote rather than people at stake in the system, what's been able to happen is that the Treasury has been able to be robbed by the collective power of the vote. So what happens is politicians end up creating voting blocks. They pit the voting blocks against each other. And all of these various blocks are trying to raid the Treasury essentially for their own personal agendas. Every single block that I can think of, in fact, is trying to raid the Treasury based on an agenda.
Right, but presumably you think some of those agendas are good, and two, you think that generally there's also good outcomes from everybody voting, right?
No, there's generally not good outcomes from everybody voting.
There's not a single good outcome, or?
I didn't say there's not a single good outcome. I'd never put it in a monolith, but
what's the question?
I just answered the question. I would not say that there's never a single good outcome.
Right. So you just happen to believe that the good outcomes don't outweigh the bad outcomes.
Well, yeah, that's how I would weigh anything when it came to the political process, right?
Right. So, okay, I mean, we can just take, for example, you think that it's generally good, just prima facie good, to protect individual freedoms, right? Like
to a degree.
Well, I think I can probably give you infinitely many cases where you would say it's good to protect I think I can give you infinitely
many cases in the opposition where you would think it was really good to limit them.
Probably not in the real world. Like I can take, for example, you waking up and breathing this morning. Mm-hmm. That's a right that's a personal freedom that should be protected.
Me waking up and owning a machine gun, is that a personal right that should be protected?
That's going to hinge on like an epistem, like that's going to be some like empirical claim that I don't.
It's not an empirical claim.
Like whether or not you.
What do you mean?
No, whether or not I think that that's a right that should be protected is going to hinge on empirical data. So whether or not that causes more bad outcomes.
Can I own a nuke?
I think probably there would be really bad outcomes if you had a nuke.
Yeah, probably. So you'd want to limit that, right?
Right.
What about a battleship with like Uzis strapped to it that did a like 360 turnstile, just mowing everything down? I should probably not have that either, right? Or hand grenades.
Right. And those are instances that we don't currently have. I'm talking about literally from you breathing to you sitting at the table to you holding a pen to you wearing a shirt to you being in the studio to being in America. Ooh, sorry. To you being able to drink water. All of those things are personal freedoms, and you believe that all of those things should be protected. And there's probably less of those like insane scenarios than...
Breathing's not a right? What do you mean? You don't have a right to breathe. It's a function of what you do.
You have a
There's
right
not an
to life.
Empirical right to it.
Right, but you have a right to life, and stopping you from breathing.
Do
would
you
be
have a right to
stopping you.
life, or do you have a concept that you have a right to life?
Yeah, the right is the concept.
The concept, yeah. So the idea here is the concept. Yeah, I'm not sure that people have a right to life. Like if you steal my TV, I don't think you have a right to life.
Well, sure, those rights can be overridden. Those are overriding
because they don't
considerations.
exist. That's why
That doesn't mean that
there's not really anything. So the concept here, right, it can be overridden and changed because the concept itself is flawed. The idea of rights themselves are flawed. So when you're talking about your like First Amendment right or something like this, when you talk about freedoms in general, yeah, I think that we have all sorts of duties which override those rights all the time.
Right. So, but you have to make the case that this is one of those instances where you should override somebody's rights. So when
since
you say,
women
well,
started voting,
hold on, don't interrupt me. That's
you just told me to give you the instances.
very impolite. Very impolite.
Do you think that
But
I'm the only one cutting in?
I think I've probably cut in far less, but look, so you think that there's all of these instances where like you shouldn't have your right to breathe infringed upon, you shouldn't have your right to XYZ. That doesn't mean that those things aren't real just because they can be overridden. I don't know what the argument for that would be.
So the concepts themselves, right? These things are changeable concepts, right?
Yeah,
all of them are changeable.
The concept itself is...
And where does the concept exist? Does it exist in all brains or does it exist in one brain?
Well, I think that people have different concepts of rights.
Right.
But what I am saying, though, is when people say, I have a right to life, they're not saying, I have a right to life in every single imaginable possible scenario. Do you know that?
Do you know that when you express things that you should express them precisely so that I know exactly what it is that you do mean? So when you you say do you know when people say X, what they actually mean is Y? It's like, no, I don't actually know that, because from what you're saying is when people say X, this is it. You just leave it on rights. That's what people say. And it's like, now you clarify and say, well, when people say X, they really don't always mean X. Like, fair enough. I can grant that is true, but you didn't really make that case before.
You're not just granting that it's true, though. Here's what happened, though, is that you said that, there's instances where these rights can be overridden, right? So you do recognize that people, when they say you have the right to life, they aren't talking about the right to life in an absolute sense.
No. That's a pedantic way to look at my words. Maybe my words were sloppy there, right? It's just a way for me to categorize the words that you understand what I'm saying. So I could say override or something like this. If you want to pin me on it, I can use a different word. But the entire idea here, though, is that these are just concepts. Because they're just concepts, they're very changeable in the human experience as concepts. And they only exist in single brains. They don't exist in collective brains, right? They can't. Every single brain has to have some variation of this concept, right?
Sure, but people have general, agreements on what a concept means.
Sure.
So they can approximate as close as they can. But when somebody says, like I said, they have the right to life or they have the right to breathe, I would think that you know that they're not saying, and also just to reframe this, because you said it's like, oh, well, when people are saying they're X, you're saying they actually mean Y. No, I'm saying they mean something like X asterisk, to the right-hand corner.
So
or
actually
something
Y.
like that. That's not what I said. I think that's kind of
it can't be X and not X. So it has to be X actually means not X.
Right, but it could be X with an additional clause that's understood to be true. Like when you have conversations, there are things that you understand with people. Like there's social cues. Like people, I think people typically understand.
I agree.
Rights aren't absolute.
I'm just making sure that if there's a meaningful distinction, we untangle the meaningful distinction. If there's not, we don't.
Sure. Okay. So when people talk about rights, because I guess we'll just get 100% clear on this now. When people talk about rights, they're typically not talking about some absolute, ability to do anything, some entitlement to do anything no matter what.